Welcome back. We began this week with an exciting local election that gained national attention, and we end this week with despair and finger pointing about another school massacre, another example of our inability to do anything about it. 17 people are dead in Parkland. Students, teachers, coaches who jumped in front of students, shielding them from the hail of bullets. A disturbed young man, missed warning signs and tips, and yet another debate about assault weapons and frustration once again that nothing will be done. We thought we'd be talking about the House 72 special election, and we will in a bit, but joining us right now are Kevin Griffith, the Vice Chair of the Sarasota Democratic Party, Jack Brill, the Vice Chair of the Sarasota Republican Party, and Kate Bradshaw, the News and Politics Editor at Creative Loafing. It's really been an up and down week, really that ended terribly, but let me ask you this, with the revelation today that the FBI missed a detailed tip that this was a disturbed young man who was threatening to kill people. And I'm wondering if it kind of obscures or skews the debate over how to prevent these tragedies, Jack, whether we're dealing with a lapse in law enforcement, school security, or the issue of assault weapons.
Yeah, number one, obviously, I can't imagine being the parent of one of the children of any child that anything happens to your children. It's the worst thing to get ever from a parent could ever happen. So, obviously, you know, the prayers that go out to these families, obviously, very, very, very devastating. Then you look at, apparently he was on Facebook, you know, talking about becoming a school shooter. The FBI gets a tip. The police were at his home 36 times, you know, since 2010, and he potentially may have been Baker acted. How did he get a gun? That's the crazy part. And this is as bad as the Texas church shooting, where the Air Force didn't let the local authorities know about that person of all the, you know, the arrests he had. I don't remember the exact charges, but they would have prevented him from ever having a gun.
Right, and Kevin, you know, there was an interesting quote that I saw today from New Yorker magazine that we don't have more mentally disturbed people in the United States than in other countries. We just arm them. We don't preclude them from getting firearms.
Alan, I'm so sad the more I hear about, the more these happen. I was on your show, I don't know when it was, 2 months ago with Las Vegas after that. And I was at a loss for words then. I'm basically at a loss for words now. The change is not going to happen from our politicians. That is clear. It has to happen, believe it or not, from students or parents or clergy. I don't know where it's coming from, but it has to come from somewhere because, you know, I have 2 little children at home, and I'm at a loss for words, frankly.
I'm actually going to have something to say about that in a moment. But Kate, let me ask you this. Are we just basically in the same old debate that we always have after every one of these massacres and tragedies, that some people say it's a gun issue, some people say it's a school security issue, some people are saying arm the teachers and the resource officers, or people are saying this is just a breakdown in law enforcement?
Well, yes and no. On one hand, I mean, it's sort of gallows humor, but you see people kind of on social media recycling the meme from the last 4 or 5 mass shootings. And The Onion always posts the same story, you know, how can we prevent this from happening, says only nation where this happens. But at the same time, I did hear Rick Scott say, finally, we need to prevent people with certain mental illnesses from getting guns. So, I mean, it's not seismic, but just from my own perspective, I thought I detected some movement.
Jack, do you see that going anywhere? Because I had Ron Chapman from the NRA on before saying there is a civil liberties issue here, that you cannot exclude people who may have mental illness issues but have not been adjudicated or convicted of a felony from their constitutional right of bearing arms.
The mental health issue in our state and every other state is much larger than is given credit to how big the issue is. I'll give you something a little interesting. I toured the Florida State Hospital up in Mariana about a month ago, which is where a lot of criminals are mental, you know, Baker Act folks. In the 1960s, that hospital held 6,000 people in a state population of Florida of 2 million. Now it has 3,000 people in a population of 21 million. So where are these folks that have these mental issues, challenges? Where are they? In the county jails? Are they out on the streets? The other thing that I'll tie into, and that's where the issue is, and I know there was a $40 million fund just put in by one of the legislators to try to increase for mental illness here in Florida. The other side you have to look at, 73%, and this is where I'll tie into what Kevin said, I apologize, for an issue, 73% of foster children commit crimes. You gotta nip it from the lack of parenting, the lack of proper supervision going on.
This young man's adopted parents died, and we have done entire shows about the lack of resources for foster children in this country. They are, I believe, 60% of foster children, when they age out, will wind up in prison in Florida. I mean, that's...
And I was saying 73%. Right. That was the stats I was
Alan,
giving.
That's on us.
The issue isn't foster children here. We're talking about politicians. Rick Scott's been in office for 8 years, and he's overseen Pulse, Fort Lauderdale, and now Parkland. And in 20 years from now, people are going to look back and at least one footnote or one note from his governorship is going to be that he oversaw these 3 mass shootings and did nothing about it. Nothing. Didn't even try. That's absurd.
Kate, I mean, does that issue resonate with voters in our area? I mean, we so often hear that people vote their pocketbooks, and when it gets down to it, they don't vote on issues like this.
I mean, when it comes to their children and grandchildren and neighbors' children getting gunned down in schools, and there are absolutely things that can be done about it. I do think that this is kind of a, it does affect the way people think about who they're sending to office.
All right, on that note, we want to share with you what some of you had to say about last night's show on protecting kids at schools. Mass shootings are happening far too often, taking place at concerts, churches, and at schools. The latest, 17 dead at a high school in South Florida. So we went to Facebook to hear your thoughts on how to prevent these from happening. Vicky says, ban all assault rifles, stricter mental health regulations for starters. Make the law so strict that if you are caught selling, buying, or owning one, it's a mandatory 10 years. Tony says, answer me this, please. Do you think criminals care about any ban you propose? And then Tony adds, change. Start with parenting your kids. Discipline is lacking, and the entitlement mentality are major factors. As long as liberals control the schools, no laws will stop this. Cassie responds, this kid's parents both died recently. He had issues. Stricter gun laws would have helped. I've been going through these comments and others like them, and I can't tell you the last time I saw someone say, I'm changing my mind. Whatever we're doing isn't working. Hoping to find consensus in our community, in our country on this issue right now is a fallacy. But it turns out, folks, we have an election in a few months, and we have 2 members of Congress on the Suncoast, Vern Buchanan and Tom Rooney. If you really care about this issue, find out what their positions are on banning assault weapons, large capacity magazines, universal background checks. If you agree with them, there you go. If you don't, seek out other candidates who represent your views and vote for them if this issue is really that important to you. Congress determines what kind of weapons are legal and what weapons are not, and you have the power to determine who makes those decisions. Yes, ma'am, I'm talking about you, and you too, sir. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We keep hearing President Trump still doesn't believe the Russians interfered in the presidential election. Well, he might want to talk to members of the federal grand jury who just indicted 13 Russians for doing just that. What about the big question? Was there any collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign? According to the indictment, some of the Russians communicated with unwitting individuals associated with the Trump campaign, but the indictment doesn't include allegations the Trump campaign knowingly colluded with the Russians. And joining us right now for more are Kevin Griffith, the vice chair of the Sarasota Democratic Party, Jack Brill, the vice chair of the Sarasota Republican Party, and Kate Bradshaw, the news and politics editor for Creative Loafing. So what are we to make of this? On one hand, the indictment talks about these communications between the Russians and unwitting members of the Trump campaign, but the Assistant Attorney General Rod Rosenstein made it clear that they are not alleging anyone in the Trump campaign with knowingly colluding with the Russians at this point. Kevin, you are the attorney.
Well, I think from, let me take a political statement here. I think President Trump should start to believe his law enforcement administration, whether it's the FBI or the Department of Justice.
Well, the FBI hasn't had exactly a good week here.
Well, but they said from the start that Russians interfered in the election, and Trump's basically been denying that the whole time, and now we have proof that they did. The collusion argument, I think the president, it's a pretty low bar for the president and his administration to collude with a foreign country to get elected, so hopefully that didn't happen. But I think, Mueller's still, the investigation's still open.
Jack, as Kevin said, the investigation continues on, and the question I often hear is if there was no collusion, why have they been working so hard to fire the FBI director, discount Mueller in the investigation? I mean, if you have nothing to hide, why don't you just let it ride out?
Well, I think it's just that the allegations have been so strong and so forceful that you're in a defensive position. And I want to go back to the two words that we've been using, unwittingly and knowingly. And in your statement, if the Russians, obviously, the Russians, was 13 individuals from 3 Russian organizations, man, we should prosecute them, even if it's an absentia, prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. So obviously, as we probably all suspected, we know they've been doing it, especially on the social media side. And now, it looks like they were duping, who knows what the campaign officials were involved. But the fact that Mueller's statement says there is not any known collusion, and it was unwittingly and unknowingly that they were doing, that the Trump campaign did not know this was going on, again, shows there wasn't any collusion, and it shows their innocence.
It is not a final word on the matter, and obviously they are getting cooperative witnesses. Rick Gates, the deputy campaign chairman, and General Flynn. So there's a lot more to learn here. And Kate, I always wonder what is the impact that this is going to have on the midterm elections. You often hear Republicans don't even care about this as an issue. Democrats do. But when you hear about this day in, day out, week after week, is it going to impact, you think, in terms of Democratic enthusiasm and Republican unenthusiasm about the coming midterms?
Well, I mean, I think it might sort of help stoke the flames of Democratic enthusiasm. I mean, with every story that comes out, to Democrats, each one is a bombshell, and they're going to interpret it, in a way that, that they see fit. But on the Republican side, it's either, it's a quote unquote nothing burger or it's fake news. So, I mean, I'm just of the belief that everybody's pretty locked in.
And we're going to talk about House 72 in a little bit, but my understanding of the polling that both the Republicans and Democrats were doing during the campaign showed that the president was underwater actually in House 72. And I'm wondering if these kinds of stories and everything else is going to keep Republican enthusiasm not where it should be at this point in the cycle, and whether you're concerned about that as you go into some very important elections, Jack.
Well, obviously, this week's election was a very good eye-opener in watching where the actual numbers, who voted in what category and how many Republicans voted for Margaret and how many MPAs, where did they go. And so there's some really interesting statistical information and numerical information that came out of it. But I also, you look at, I go back to a statement I've said many, many times. All politics is local. You always have the influence from D.C., but you need to look at the candidates themselves and what they bring to the election.
I want to go back to that point in a second, but before we do, Kevin, When you look at the Russia investigation, is this something that Democrats do at this point think is more important than just about anything else in terms of where this is going and casting a pall over this administration for the next 9 months?
I think it just feeds into this, what Jeb Bush said way back in during the debate, that Donald Trump was the chaos candidate, and he continues to be a president where chaos reigns. I mean, you had Reince Priebus today, or this week on TV talking about the chaos that was going on in the White House and multiply it by 50 in reality. And I think that's going to continue to go on because that's his personality. That's Trump's personality.
We have to take a quick break, and we'll be back with the special election in House 72 in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Our guests join us right now to discuss the results of the House 72 special election. And Jack, I want to go back to a point that you were making, that all politics is local, the famous expression by Tip O'Neill. You could all correct me if I'm wrong here, but you know, I covered this race pretty closely, and I'm unaware of any particular local issue that this race fell on. It seemed to me it was almost a reflection of the national mood. Kate?
Well, I definitely admit that I didn't watch it nearly as closely as you did, but I definitely, the impression I got was that, you know, just like the St. Petersburg mayor's race, I live in St. Pete, it was largely nationalized, and you know, there were a lot of Trump comparisons.
Right, and look, nobody is going to compare James Buchanan to Donald Trump. Right. But what we kept on hearing about is, you know, that women were motivated, that the Republicans weren't exactly enthusiastic. I don't know what issue you could see that, you know, James and Margaret debate upon that the voters turned one way or the other, Jack.
No, and I even think with the debate you had here, you know, the thought process afterwards, everyone got their message out, they did a good job, but did it sway any voters? Probably not, you know, from that standpoint. You know, we had a very good candidate in James Buchanan. Obviously, you know, Kevin's team had a very good candidate in Margaret Good. The ladies' vote came out very strong on Election Day, and from the Republican side and on the NPA side.
You were surprised by that because I remember when you first got here the other night, you were like, we have this one because Republican voting late in the day was so large. What we did not take into consideration is a lot of those Republican women weren't voting for James Buchanan. And
I'll be the first to admit, because we were, you know, we were up like 2,600 votes for the day, and that's usually a good buffer to pull over the early voting and the absentee voting. And at the end of the day, netted out, James only won the day by 100 votes.
Kevin, let me ask you this, because Politico Florida did a very interesting story today that pointed out that in this special election, 3,200 fewer Democrats came out to vote in this special election than in the midterms. 9,600 fewer Republicans came out to vote, citing it was a depressed Republican turnout. And the warning to Democrats is, don't count on that in November during the midterms, that the Republicans are likely to come out in force, so don't get too comfortable in that seat.
I think what the community is going to learn is what we already knew as a party, is that Margaret Good is going to work really, really hard, tirelessly, frankly, for every person in Sarasota County. And she knows that, and she knows that she needs to go earn the vote of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. I will say, going back to what we talked about issue-wise, one big issue was education, because Margaret came out very strong for public education, and James Buchanan, the Republicans, came out very strong against public education, and that's a big deal.
It was not about against public. There's nobody who's against public education.
There are two issues I want to get to quickly. And Kate, number one is, what kind of earthquake was this in the political world in these parts?
Well, I mean, a lot of people from other parts of the state were watching this pretty closely. Other parts of the country, I mean, it was a very important bellwether election, just like Congressional District 13 was in 2014 going into those midterms. I mean, everybody just wants to read the tea leaves.
All right, so there's a lot of talk about who is going to run as a Republican for this seat in just 9 months from now. I hear there may be a Brill in the works.
I hear a lot of names out there.
Yeah,
so,
but you know.
But remember, everyone, James is still making a decision whether James is going to run. If James decides to run, he'll be the nominee. Just
Right,
you know,
and Joe
let's-
Gruters is quoted as saying that if he wants to run, he is the presumptive nominee.
Absolutely.
But we are also hearing, in addition to Vicky Brill, Ray Pilon, the former state representative who used to hold that seat, and Bridget Ziegler, the chairwoman of the Education Board. So, I mean,
And we've heard other names too. You know, County Commissioner Paul Carajula. There are a couple other folks that have talked about it. So it's going to be an interesting few weeks.
So assuming that James Buchanan doesn't run, what does the Republican Party look for, and what how do you shake it out, Kevin?
Well, let's just take a step back here. The Democrats just won maybe what was the biggest election in Southwest Florida in the last decade. And so we're going to enjoy it a little bit. But I'd also tell the people at home, if you voted or if you didn't vote, Margaret Good is going to work really, really hard. Just so everyone knows, she was elected on Tuesday night. She was sworn in at 1:30 on Wednesday. That means in the morning she had to get in a car, drive 5 hours to Tallahassee, get sworn in, and then was on an education committee asking questions on Thursday.
10 seconds, what do Republicans have to do?
We will have a very good candidate, well-versed, knowledgeable. November is going to be a lot different than the special election. There will not be all the outside money. It'll be based on the facts. And, you know, Margaret did a good job, but she's only going to be there for 3 weeks. Session's done
Okay.
March 9th.
We have to leave it there. We have to take a quick break, and we'll be back in a moment.